Vekis had mapped 17 death worlds in his 40-year career as a surveyor for the Throlian Expeditionary Commission, and he'd developed what he considered a healthy respect for planets that actively tried to kill you. Gas giants with storms that could swallow moons whole, manageable with proper shielding, ice worlds where the atmosphere froze solid at night, unpleasant but predictable, radiation-soaked hellscapes orbiting dying stars. Pack extra medication and don't lick anything glowing. But Kepler 288d, affectionately nicknamed the Eraser by the 3 previous survey teams who'd failed to map it, was something else entirely. The planet didn't kill you with drama or spectacle. It simply made you disappear, along with every trace that you'd ever been there at all. The jungle consumed everything. Not metaphorically, not gradually over centuries like a normal ecosystem, but actively and with what Vekis could only describe as malicious efficiency. Trail markers corroded within hours. Machete-cut paths sealed themselves by morning. Electronic beacons simply stopped transmitting, their signals swallowed by vegetation that grew thick enough to block orbital scans. 4 expeditions had landed on the Eraser. 0 had completed a full planetary survey. 2 hadn't even made it back to orbit, their fate unknown except for the certainty that the jungle had erased them as thoroughly as it erased everything else. The Throlian Commission had finally done what any sensible organization would do when faced with an impossible task. They'd outsourced it to someone desperate enough to accept a suicide contract for the right price. They'd hired a human. Vekis stared at the personnel file on his datapad with the kind of resigned horror usually reserved for terminal medical diagnoses. Marcus Webb, 38 standard years old, formerly a construction engineer for the Terran Colonial Infrastructure Division, currently listed as a freelance pioneer with a reputation for taking jobs that made insurance companies weep. His reference list included projects with names like the Sisyphus Plateau Crossing and that dam on Terentia 7 that everyone said was impossible. The fact that these projects were completed successfully somehow made Vekis feel worse, not better. Humans had been part of the galactic community for barely a century, and in that time they'd developed a reputation for being the species you called when the job was either impossible or so monumentally stupid that no one else would touch it. They were the cosmic equivalent of that friend who responds to "I dare you" with genuine enthusiasm rather than common sense. The worst part was that they usually survived. Marcus Webb arrived at the orbital station 3 days before the scheduled drop, which gave Vekis just enough time to brief him on the 17 different ways Kepler 288d would try to kill him and erase all evidence of his existence. The human listened with an expression that Vekis's translator software unhelpfully labeled as amused interest, which seemed profoundly inappropriate given the circumstances. So basically, Marcus said when Vekis finished the briefing, the jungle has a reset button and it presses it every few hours. That is a disturbingly accurate simplification, Vekis admitted, his bilateral throat sacs deflating in what might have been a sigh if Throlians had lungs. Every previous expedition has failed to maintain navigational reference points long enough to complete even a basic survey. The ecosystem appears to have evolved specifically to eliminate persistent markers of any kind. We've lost valuable personnel and considerable funding attempting to survey this planet. But the mineral deposits make it worth the trouble. The rare earth concentration in the northern continent alone would fund 3 colony expansions, Vekis said. If we could actually map where they are and maintain access routes to extract them, which we cannot, because the jungle erases everything. Marcus grinned, which exposed an uncomfortable number of teeth. Humans had retained their predator dentition despite millennia of civilization, and moments like this reminded everyone else why that was unsettling. Sounds like a challenge. It sounds like elaborate suicide with extra steps, Vekis corrected. I am legally obligated to ensure you understand the risks before deployment. I read the contract. I watched the archive footage. I know what I'm doing. That was precisely what worried Vekis. In his experience, humans who claimed to know what they were doing were the most dangerous kind because they usually did know, and their plans were invariably insane by any rational standard. The drop went smoothly, which should have been the first warning sign that everything else would go wrong. Marcus landed in a clearing near the equatorial zone, right on target, with enough supplies to last 3 months if rationed carefully. The vegetation around the landing site was already showing interest in the new arrival, vines creeping toward the scorch marks from the descent engines with visible enthusiasm. Vekis monitored from orbit, tracking the human's biometric signature and waiting for the inevitable distress call. It came sooner than expected, but not in the form he'd anticipated. "Yeah, so the landing site is already gone," Marcus reported 3 hours after touchdown. His voice carried none of the panic Vekis had been expecting. "The jungle grew over the blast zone completely. Can't see the ship from 30 meters away. Also, the communication beacon you guys installed corroded through. I'm on backup transmitter now." "We used military-grade, corrosion-resistant alloys," Vekis protested. "Those beacons are rated for 100 years in Class 5 caustic environments." "Well, this jungle apparently didn't read the specifications. The casing looks like it's been here for a decade. I'm seeing advanced botanical acid erosion and some kind of fungal metal consumption. Honestly, pretty impressive from a biological engineering standpoint. You're meant to be concerned, not impressed. I can be both. Anyway, starting the survey route, I'll check in every 6 hours." The first day proceeded with agonizing normalcy, which meant the jungle erased every single trail marker Marcus placed within hours of placement. The biodegradable polymer stakes dissolved. The reflective paint markers got covered by aggressive lichen growth. Even the simple rock cairns got dismantled by something, possibly the local fauna, possibly the jungle itself out of pure spite. Vekis watched the satellite feed and began drafting the incident report in his head. Another human lost to the eraser. He'd have to notify the Terran authorities, file the death certificate, process the insurance claim. The paperwork alone would take weeks. Then Marcus did something that made Vekis question whether the human had suffered atmospheric contamination and gone completely insane. He started a fire, not a small campfire for warmth and cooking. A proper, aggressive, scorched earth wildfire that consumed everything in a 100-meter radius and left behind charred devastation that could be seen from orbit. Then he did it again, and again. Every 5 kilometers along his survey route, Marcus Webb was burning strategic sections of jungle down to bare soil. "What are you doing?" Vekis transmitted, his voice hitting frequencies that the universal translator rendered as horrified screeching. "Creating waypoints," Marcus replied, far too casually for someone committing ecological war crimes. "The jungle can regrow over a trail in hours. Let's see it regrow over this in hours. You're destroying the native ecosystem. I'm surveying the planet like you hired me to do. The ecosystem will be fine. This jungle's been dealing with forest fires since before your species invented the wheel, probably before it invented the concept of circular objects. It'll bounce back." The human was right, which somehow made it worse. The jungle did immediately begin reclaiming the burned areas, but the fire breaks Marcus created were large enough and thorough enough that the regrowth would take days instead of hours. It was the ecological equivalent of leaving a scar so obvious that no amount of healing could hide it quickly. But Marcus wasn't just burning. That would have been destructive enough. No, the human was building. He started with drainage. Simple ditches dug along the routes between his fire-cleared waypoints, channels that directed water away from what would become paths. Vekis watched through the satellite feed as Marcus spent hours digging trenches with nothing but a folding shovel and what appeared to be profound stubbornness. Then came the rocks. Marcus collected stones from streambeds, hauled them in improvised slings, and used them to line his drainage ditches and create raised paths through the wettest areas. The jungle kept trying to reclaim the spaces, kept sending roots and vines questing across the cleared ground, but Marcus's earthworks forced the vegetation to work around them rather than through them. Those paths won't last a week, Vekis observed, watching the human stack stones into crude retaining walls. Don't need them to last forever, Marcus grunted, apparently unbothered by the physical labor that would have exhausted most species. Just need them to last long enough for me to finish the survey and get back. The jungle can have it all back when I'm done. The method was crude, brutish, and entirely lacking in the elegant solutions that civilized species preferred. It was also working. Marcus's survey route was slowly but steadily advancing through territory that had defeated every previous attempt. The paths were ugly, the cleared areas were scarred, and the whole enterprise had the aesthetic appeal of a construction site, but the human was making progress. Vekis found himself checking the satellite feed more frequently than strictly necessary, watching Marcus work with a mixture of professional interest and morbid fascination. The human had established a pattern: advance 5 kilometers, clear a firebreak zone, dig drainage, stack stones, plant a fire pit in the center, and move on. The fire pits were particularly interesting. Marcus built them from stacked rocks and lined them with clay he dug from riverbanks, and he kept them burning constantly with slow-burning wood from specific tree species he'd identified as resistant to the jungle's rapid decay processes. The fires serve as navigation beacons, Marcus explained during one of his 6-hour check-ins. I can see the smoke from 10 kilometers away, plus the heat keeps the vegetation at bay. The jungle really doesn't like the cleared areas around the fire pits. Seems to avoid them actively rather than just slowly reclaiming them. You've noticed behavioral patterns in the vegetation. Oh yeah, this jungle is definitely operating on some kind of collective response system. Watch any cleared area for an hour, and you'll see it. The plants don't just grow randomly back into open spaces. They probe first, testing with small shoots and vines. If those survive, then the main growth follows. But if something actively hostile is present, like fire or concentrated human stubbornness, the whole system backs off and tries a different approach. Vekis accessed his geological surveys of the planet. Kepler 288d has several apex predator species, large herbivores and their corresponding predators, megafauna in the classification range that would dwarf Earth elephants. Yeah, I've seen the dung piles. Whatever's leaving those around is big enough to make me grateful I brought the high-powered deterrent rifle. Your point? Trails would make hunting easier for predators. Any persistent game trail becomes a highway for the species that prey on trail users. If the jungle evolved to eliminate trails as quickly as possible, it would be an effective defense mechanism against predator optimization of hunting routes. There was a long pause on the other end. Then Marcus laughed, which was the kind of barking sound that made Vekis's auditory frills flatten in reflexive discomfort. That's brilliant. The jungle isn't trying to erase trails out of spite or weird alien plant consciousness. It's protecting itself from its own food chain. Anything that makes a habit of using the same path becomes predictable. Predictable gets you eaten. So the ecosystem evolved to eliminate predictability by erasing paths, which means every previous survey team was creating perfect hunting grounds for predators by trying to establish trails, and probably getting picked off one by one as they followed their own paths right into ambush zones. Oh, that's dark. I love it. Marcus sounded genuinely delighted by the revelation that he was walking through a jungle that had evolved specifically to make navigation impossible and had probably killed his predecessors via ecological conspiracy with apex predators. Humans were deeply strange. Does this change your approach? Vekis asked. Nope. Actually makes me feel better about the fire and ditches method. My cleared routes are too wide and too open. Nothing big enough to threaten me is going to walk across 100 meters of burned ground to get to the noisy human in the middle. Predators like cover. I'm eliminating cover. The jungle hates it, the predators avoid it, and I get to finish my survey without becoming something's lunch. Everybody wins except the vegetation, and honestly it was trying to kill me anyway, so I don't feel bad. The survey continued. Marcus advanced through the territory with relentless determination, leaving behind a network of crude paths, drainage systems, and constantly burning fire pits that turned the jungle into something that looked like a war zone designed by a particularly aggressive civil engineer. The satellite imagery showed a growing web of cleared routes spreading across the northern continent, scars on the landscape that would take weeks to heal instead of hours. Vekis started receiving complaints from the Ecological Monitoring Division about environmental impact violations. He filed them under things to worry about after confirming the human survives, and continued tracking Marcus's progress. 2 months into the 3-month contract, Marcus completed the full survey route. Every mineral deposit in the northern continent mapped. Every potential extraction site identified. Every access route documented with coordinates and detailed notes about terrain challenges. The human had accomplished in 60 days what 3 previous expeditions had failed to achieve in twice the time. Coming back to base camp, Marcus reported. Should reach the original landing site in about 3 days if the return paths are still viable. They were, barely. The jungle had been working overtime to reclaim the cleared routes, and in places the vegetation had nearly succeeded. But the drainage systems Marcus had built kept the paths from becoming impassable mud, and the fire pits provided waypoints that even the jungle's aggressive growth couldn't completely obscure. Marcus made it back to his landing site without incident, unless you counted the part where he had to detour around a herd of 6-legged herbivores that looked like they could crush the survey vehicle by sneezing on it. The extraction shuttle arrived on schedule. Marcus loaded his equipment and samples, transmitted the complete survey data to Vekis, and departed from a planet that had swallowed 4 previous expeditions without a trace. I will admit, Vekis said during the debriefing, I did not expect you to survive, let alone succeed. Yeah, I got that impression from the way you kept checking if I was still alive every 6 hours. You violated approximately 40 environmental protection protocols and caused ecological damage that will take years to fully remediate. Marcus shrugged, which was a gesture that seemed to communicate both acknowledgement and complete lack of concern simultaneously. Humans were remarkably efficient at non-verbal disrespect. The contract specified completion of the survey by any means necessary. You didn't say it had to be pretty. Besides, the jungle's already reclaiming everything. Give it a year, and you won't even be able to tell I was there. That wasn't entirely true. As later monitoring would reveal, most of Marcus's paths did disappear within months, consumed by the jungle's relentless growth. The drainage ditches filled in. The stone markers got scattered by animals or buried by vegetation. The crude roads became faint depressions in the landscape, then nothing at all. But the fire pits remained. 27 strategically placed clearings scattered across the northern continent, each one approximately 100 meters in diameter, each one stubbornly refusing to be reclaimed by the surrounding jungle. The vegetation grew right up to the edges of the burned zones and then stopped, as if the ecosystem itself had learned that those particular spots were more trouble than they were worth. Vekis filed his final report 3 months after Marcus's departure. The survey data was solid, the mineral deposits were confirmed, and the Throlian Commission was already planning extraction operations. They'd use Marcus's fire pit locations as base camps, expanding them into proper installations now that they knew the jungle would mostly leave them alone. The human had scarred a planet that erased everything, and somehow convinced it to keep the scars. Vekis approved payment on Marcus's contract and flagged his file for future impossible jobs. The galaxy had no shortage of planets that defeated conventional approaches. It apparently also had no shortage of humans willing to solve problems by simply refusing to accept that problems were unsolvable. 6 months later, Vekis received notification of a new survey contract for a planet designated Helheim 9, a frozen death world where every previous expedition had vanished into ice storms that erased all trace of their passage. The job posting specifically requested a human contractor with experience in hostile environment navigation and a documented history of surviving places that killed everyone else. Marcus Webb accepted the contract within an hour of posting. Vekis drafted a preliminary incident report and began the paperwork for another inevitable emergency extraction. The human would probably survive this one too, using some combination of stubbornness, environmental destruction, and strategies that would horrify any reasonable civilization. The galaxy had spent millennia developing sophisticated techniques for exploring hostile worlds. Humans had spent a century proving that sometimes the sophisticated approach was just overthinking the problem, and what you really needed was someone willing to burn everything down and build roads through the ashes. The jungle had erased every trail. The human had left roads and firelight behind, and forced the jungle to learn to live with them. Somewhere in the Throlian Expeditionary Commission, an accountant was calculating the environmental remediation costs and weeping quietly into their data logs. Somewhere else, a human was packing for another impossible job, already planning which parts of the next hostile planet would need to be set on fire to make it cooperate. The universe continued turning, slightly scarred, considerably confused and grudgingly admitting that sometimes the species that refused to give up was more terrifying than the planet that refused to let you survive. Vekis filed his reports, approved the next contract, and wondered if he should start investing in fire-resistant survey equipment. Probably. The humans weren't going to stop, and neither were the planets that tried to kill them. But increasingly, the smart money was betting on the humans, because the planets at least had the good sense to give up occasionally. Humans apparently had no such sense at all, which was working out surprisingly well for everyone who needed impossible jobs completed by unreasonable means. The eraser had met someone more stubborn than itself, and the jungle was still trying to figure out how that was possible.